All right, let's go ahead and get started, everyone. I'm really grateful to have you all here today. Excited for another wonderful seminar with an external speaker that we're really happy to have with us. On the announcements front, if you're a student, please sign in if you're here in person, and afterward you can join Dr. Perry and Brittany Jones from social work and our other trainee, Adam Bisoke, for pizza lunch and a conversation with the speaker, no faculty allowed, in rate 221 with pizza. I think that's all I have. Any other announcements?
There's so many talks coming up.
Yes. Oh, yes. Next week we have the ability to meet with Dr. Laura Lindberg. I would look her up if you're not aware of her. She's wonderful. On Monday of next week, and you'll see all of this in your CSDE emails. And then the university lecture of Dr. Victor Luckerson, who's going to be talking about the bombing of Greenwood in Oklahoma and what's happened since. We have the really wonderful opportunity for y'all to have a students only coffee with him on Wednesday. And without further ado, Pat Louie to introduce our speaker.
Thank you. Okay. So we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Bria Perry. Dr. Bria Perry is the Alan D. and Polly S. Grimshaw Professor in the Department of Sociology, Associate Director of the Ursay Institute for Sociomedical Science Research, and the Vice Provost and Associate Vice President for Research at Indiana University. Her research investigates the intersecting influence of social networks, biomarkers, social psychology, and social inequality in health and illness. Bria's work often focuses on psychological and brain diseases, including neurological disorders common in aging, mental illness, and substance use disorders. Bria has received over $19 million in funding from the National Institutes of Health, as well as the National Science Foundation, Russell Sage Foundation, and other charitable foundations. She was elected to the Sociological Research Association in 2021 and was a National Academy of Medicine Emerging Leaders in Health and Medicine Scholar from 2019 to 2022. Please join me in welcoming Bria Perry.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here. You have a beautiful campus. This is a gorgeous room and it's not raining, so winds all around. I am going to try to share my screen. I have to project, and if somebody asks a question, I have to repeat it. Okay, I'm totally going to forget that. So please interject and remind me when it comes time for the Q&A, because that's like 40 minutes from now, and I don't know what's going to be happening then. So thanks for having me. I'm going to talk to you today about some research it's not just my research, it's the research of my lab. And so it takes a village, honestly, to make this kind of interdisciplinary research happen. So I'm really grateful to my collaborators. But I'm going to talk to you today about aging in the social brain and some work we've been doing on social networks and Alzheimer's disease. No, it doesn't want to advance. Okay, there we go. So I got interested in this line of research a little over a decade ago. Social networks is kind of a through line of my research. It kind of touches everything that I do. I'm just really particularly interested in applying social network theory to diverse social problems and diverse kinds of problems of health and illness. So I read this really fascinating article that related online social network size, so specifically your number of Facebook friends, to your human brain structure. So essentially the structure of your brain and the areas of the brain that are associated with processing social cognition. And so I thought this was super interesting. I love biomarkers. And in particular, I'm interested in kind of the biological mechanisms that underlie the relationship between social networks and health. So this article really caught my eye. And of course, like this can go both ways, right? So you might have a really like plumpened brain, and this is associated with your ability to maintain large and diverse social networks. Or it could be that being embedded in these kind of networks is associated with changes in your brain, the functional connectivity and structure of your brain over time. And that article didn't really address this. But then there's some really great research on these rhesus macaques, which are adorable. Don't look at them online because you'll be like spending an hour looking at baby monkeys. And so you can sort of manipulate the social networks of monkeys in ways that you can't manipulate human social networks. And so there's all this really great prospective research on what happens to these macaques' brains when you change the number of cage mates that they have, when you increase sort of the size and complexity of their networks. Their brains become more functionally connected and structurally larger over time. And you can actually observe that. So this just was super interesting to me. So then when I become interested in something, I'm like, okay, how am I going to get money for this? I want to do this. And so I started looking into Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, which is a really fascinating area of research with lots of variability in the sort of course and outcomes of ADRD dependent on the social environment. So it seems sort of ripe for this area of research. We probably all sort of know a little bit about ADRD, but it's this progressive age-related disease marked by brain atrophy and a loss of cognitive function over time. But the changes in the brain can actually occur decades before you see any loss of cognitive function, which makes really interesting from sort of an intervention standpoint. It has a huge global burden, 78 million by 2030, and it's the third leading cause of death among older adults. And so I started looking into the research on social connectedness and ADRD. And I was really disappointed when I found out that there's a lot of research, actually. There was already quite a bit. Mostly, none of it done by sociologists, most of it done by people in psychology or neuroscience. And so what they had found is this sort of strong link between older adults' social connectedness, and I'm being sort of like intentionally vague with that term. It's kind of all-encompassing, which reflects measurement, heterogeneity in this area, and the onset and course of AD dementia. So by now, there's a ton of prospective longitudinal evidence that changes in networks are associated changes in networks are associated with rates of cognitive decline. There's like 8 or 9 meta-analyses at this point. So the evidence is really good that the connection is there. But what's been missing is kind of a lack of understanding of both the social on one hand and also the biological mechanisms underlying that association. They're sort of unclear and contested. There's like sort of no clear idea in the literature. So there really was this kind of absence of a unifying theory of social risk and resilience. Which meant that a lot of the research was kind of all over the board and really sort of hypothetical about what could actually be causing this connection. And then just like measurement heterogeneity like you would not believe. Lots of imprecision, lots of sort of less than ideal measures of the social environment that don't really pinpoint particular social or biological mechanisms. So things like network size, which is fine, but anybody who studies networks knows that can mean like a million different things. Frequency of social contact, perceived support, participation in social activities, even things like loneliness or marital status were conceived as social networks or social connectedness. And so those things, you know, if you're someone who studies social networks or social relationships, you know that those things can be related to very different mechanisms. So there wasn't really a lot to go on in terms of mechanisms. So then I started looking at kind of prominent social network theories and how those might or might not map onto biological theories of Alzheimer's disease risk and resilience. And so I started with social bridging. And so this comes from Lynn's research, Granovetter's research, Coleman, Burt, Putnam. And basically the idea that if you're embedded in larger, more diverse, more complex networks with weaker ties, that it confers this bridging social capital, that you get access to novel information, novel resources. If you're bridging 2 networks, you're bridging a structural whole, then you have access to information that the other people don't. And so the idea is that maybe being in these kinds of networks would be associated with cognitive stimulation, a sort of cognitive enrichment that could be good for the brain and that could protect it. And that maps on really nicely to a prominent theory of cognitive resilience in neuroscience, which is called cognitive reserve or brain reserve. And the idea here is that we all experience these sort of enrichment experiences across the life course that provide different degrees of reserve against neurodegeneration. So there's actually a lot of slippage, a lot of variation in the linkage between your underlying neuropathology and your cognitive outcomes. So this is just one example. This isn't my study, but so if you're looking at these 3 brains, The red is bad. It's amyloid positivity. So amyloid plaques are one of the things in the brain that's a sign of Alzheimer's related neuropathology. And so if you look at the brain on the right, they're amyloid negative and cognitively normal. If you look at the brain on the left, they're amyloid positive and have Alzheimer's disease because they have accompanying cognitive decline. But the person in the middle has a similar degree of amyloid positivity or a similar sort of neurodegeneration and neuropathology burden in the brain, but they're cognitively normal. So we would say that the person in the middle has cognitive reserve. And so what confers this cognitive reserve? In the literature, there's been a lot of research on things like education level, occupational complexity, but very little or almost nothing, in fact, on sort of social enrichment as a way to build up cognitive reserve over the life course. And then the other mechanism, this I would say is like sort of the more common mechanism through the social sciences. A lot of people look at sort of social bonding as being beneficial for health, and we tend to kind of ignore bridging actually. So this was really easy to find a lot of literature to support this idea that being in these bonding type networks that are densely connected, cohesive, kin-centered, high levels of support, high levels of social integration, that those might be associated with positive brain health. And there was some evidence to support this. And so this actually maps onto another sort of theory of Alzheimer's disease pathology through these neuroendocrine regulation mechanisms. And the idea here is that social networks help you regulate hormone production and the metabolism of hormones, which improves downstream cognitive memory. So bonding networks might have these sort of cascading consequences that reduce neurodegenerative effects, especially of stress. So there may be some stress buffering mechanisms here. But also we know that there are studies, for example, that suggest that social support and loneliness are associated with levels of oxytocin, which is a neurotransmitter in the brain. It's called sometimes the love neurotransmitter. Like if you hug somebody, it releases oxytocin. It's really good for your brain. So go snuggle somebody later. And basal cortisol levels. So it's associated with sort of lower levels of stress hormones in the brain. And then also downregulation, ability to downregulate the HPA axis, which is a stress buffering mechanism. So here we've identified two theories of networks that kind of look different that might be associated with biological mechanisms that are protective of ADRD. So now I'm going to tell you what I think I kind of know based on almost a decade now of research in this area. So what are the social network mechanisms that are implicated in cognitive aging according to our studies? And what are the biological mechanisms that underlie those? I'm going to leverage data from the social networks in Alzheimer's disease study, which is my cohort study. Early on, we used the acronym SNAD, and it kind of stuck, and it's a horrible acronym. It sounds like phlegm. So my lesson to young investigators is pick an acronym that you actually like, because it won't go away ever. Now I'm stuck with it. So we leverage an NIH-funded ADRC, Alzheimer's Disease Research Center, which is an NIH P30, and they have a longitudinal cohort of about 600 older adults. And so the advantage of linking up with them is that they collect really extensive clinical cognitive data annually, like all the cognitive measures that you could possibly want. They have consensus diagnosis, which is really important. If any of you use something like the HRS, you always get reviewer questions about whether it's really Alzheimer's disease or not. Here we have like neurologists and clinicians in a room that decide collectively that they have Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment or not. And then really rich neuroimaging data, which is super expensive to collect. I don't know how to do it. I don't want to do it. I just want someone to give me something that I can plug in my regression model, which is what it's fabulous. And so what we do on our side is we add annual in-person interviews to collect social network data, as well as a lot of other rich social data to try to understand what exactly are the social mechanisms that are driving these relationships. Our cohort is 50% cognitively normal, 25% mild cognitive impairment. If you didn't know someone really well and they had MCI, you wouldn't know that they had it, just as like kind of a litmus test. And then 25% have early stage Alzheimer's disease. The advantage, and then all of them, this is a really cool part of this particular P30, is that they're all at high risk for ADRD, either because they have 2 copies of the E4 allele of ApoE, or they have familial risk, or they're at advanced age. So the nice thing is we can observe them longitudinally, and we see a lot of conversion from normal to MCI to ADRD. And then it's about 60% women, 80% white, which is not great, but it's actually good for Indiana. Mean age of 71 and mean education of 15 years. So we use personal social network methodology. So we collect social network data that has the advantage of being able to disaggregate distinct dimensions of social connectedness. So you can collect these data, and then they're really flexible in terms of being able to construct measures that sort of pointedly relate to a specific social mechanism. And so the first step in doing this is that we elicit the names of people in the network, which we call alters. None of the language here makes any sense. It's all like stupid, but you know, it is what it is. So the first step is you use a series of what's called name generators to get people to name people in their network. And I'll tell you what those are in a minute. And then we ask follow-up questions about each alter that's named. So we can ask things like, what's your gender, what's your education level, how close are you, how often do you see them, et cetera. And then for the third step, we ask them to tell us how the alters are connected to each other, which is how we get the structural measures of personal social networks. And then we use Network Canvas, which is a fabulous, fabulous tool out of Northwestern, and I'm happy to talk about it in the Q&A. So these are the name generators that we use, and this is really important because the name generators essentially define the operational boundaries of your network. And a real advantage of our study is that we use a multiple name generator approach, lots of name generators, so we get nice, big, fat networks. We can see sort of the peripheral part of networks. We can see social bridging in ways that you can't in a lot of the existing studies of older adults networks, where their network size might be like 4 or 5 on average. So we ask about health and important matters discussants. We ask who they spend their time with socially. We ask about family members that they see or talk to regularly, coworkers or fellow volunteers, neighbors, anyone else who's important that you haven't mentioned. And then we also, everybody in the study has a study partner. That's a whole other can of worms that I'm happy to talk about in the Q&A. But you can see it's pretty extensive. It's kind of like, you know, we don't know who's in their network, but we're shining a flashlight on as many sort of corners of that personal network of their regular interaction partners as we can. And then after we collect the data about each alter, we can then start creating these network measures that operationalize the theories that I mentioned at the beginning. So for social bridging, we might be looking at things like network size, effective size, which is kind of like the number of like distinct unconnected components in the network, the density or how like tightly connected they are, minimum tie strength, which is sort of like a measure of whether they have any weak ties. Soul bridging, like do you sit in a structured position, bridging a structural whole, and diversity is role diversity, which is how many different kinds of social roles do you have in your network. And then for bonding, we use things like number of close ties, support multiplexity, which is how many kinds of support the network provides on average, mean frequency of contact, quality of social relationships, that kind of stuff. And then these are the control variables that we typically use in most of our models. And then we can use those to create, in this case, we often use a latent variable approach. So you're going to see like weird little faces in the corner of my slides. And so I do that when I have, most of them are trainees that work under me. If they're the first author or they produce the figure, then you know, I'll sort of credit them with their little cute faces. And so this is Peng. So we have used and sort of verified this latent variable approach to measuring social bridging and social bonding. And this is important because sometimes it's hard to know what to do in a regression model when you have a bunch of measures that are correlated with one another and which create multicollinearity if you throw them in a model, but you don't know which one is sort of the best measure of this underlying thing. So we've created these latent variables and they work super well and they're like pretty normally distributed and it makes everything beautiful and easy. So if you see sort of one measure of bridging capital or bonding capital, that's what it is. It's a latent variable. For measures of cognitive function, we can measure both general and social cognition. So we often use what's called the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is a measure of global cognitive function. This is the instrument that's used to collect these data. This is actually the test that Donald Trump in his first term said he took an intelligence test and got a near perfect score. This is what it was. It's like, what is this animal? So it's like clearly a very just like baseline kind of indicator of cognitive decline. It's not an intelligence test, but we can also measure things like episodic memory, verbal fluency, processing speed, and executive function that are all indicators of early stage Alzheimer's disease or MCI, and which also don't have kind of a ceiling like the MOCA has, because they're like timed tests, a lot of them, and so forth. And then I also have this amazing colleague, Anne Crindle, who studies social cognition. And so we collect measures of face memory and emotion recognition. And she has this absolutely amazing measure of theory of mind where she shows older adults clips from The Office. You guys know this show? Or Nathan for You, which is less popular, but also weird. And then asks follow-up questions about, like, you know, what was, what's his name's intention when he put Dwight's stapler on the Jello, you know, like, and so you can sort of measure older adults' capacity for essentially taking the role of the other, which is what theory of mind is if you're a sociologist. And it's really cool. So we use those as well. And then we use quantitative neuroimaging phenotypes. We have functional MRI, and so we're starting to explore resting state data. But mostly what we've used so far is structural data. And so literally you take these pictures of the brain, this functional MRI, and then you measure things like the thickness of the cerebral cortex or the volume of gray matter in the brain. And you can use those as a measure of essentially the structural integrity of the brain or as a measure of atrophy if you look at it over time. Okay, so what do we find regarding social mechanisms? So this is just a very simple comparison of network ideal type, which means that I built these networks based on average characteristics for these two groups for high and low cognitive function. And so the network on the left is what the average network looks like for someone who has low cognition. So -1 standard deviation on 3 or more indicators. And then the one on the right is people who have high cognition. So +1 standard deviation on 3 or more measures. And you can see that these networks look very different. So the one on the left, you can see the things to note are it's comprised entirely of kin. Everybody's connected to everybody else, so it's very dense. And it's much smaller than the other network. The network on the right, reflective of someone with high cognition, has a lot of diversity with respect to the social roles that make up the network. You can see that the ego, who by virtue of the data collection is connected to everyone in this network, is bridging lots of structural holes. It's larger. And if we had closeness represented here, you would see that these ties are weaker on average. And so right away, we can see these differences, right? But so then the question is, let's dig in and see, like, where are these coming from? This is a graph that I like to put up, which, you know, I haven't published this, but it's kind of a kitchen sink approach to trying to understand what social mechanisms matter. And so we tried to essentially collect data on almost all the things that are represented in the literature on social connectedness and cognitive health so far, and sort of test them against each other and just see which ones are significant. Can we see any patterns sort of by mechanism? And so it's hard to read and hard to look at. I apologize for that. But the top level findings are, if you look at the blue, those are all sort of measures of social participation. Are you married? Do you have kids? Do you volunteer? Are you still working? Do you go to church? And then the sort of yellowish is what I would call social stressors, not in the stress process sense, but in like the sense of stress that comes from social networks. So one is bereavement and the other is mean hassles in the network. So how much does your network hassle, cause you problems, or make life difficult? And then the purple is social bonding. So these are relationship quality measures, social integration scale, the perceived social support scale, and then some network measures that reflect bonding. And then on the right is all of our measures of social bridging, which includes the ones I've talked about so far, but also some really cool ones that I'm excited to dig into, but I've not had time to do. So for example, we find that if your relationship or if your network is more racially homophilous, then you have lower cognitive function. So having some racial diversity in your network is good. The same is true for age diversity in your network. And then we have some of the measures I talked about, but also cool ones like we asked them to look at the number of contacts in their phone. That's associated with better cognitive function. And so you can see if you're looking at broad patterns that it's really the set of measures on the right that is just sort of consistently associated with better cognitive function, whereas the social bonding measures are not, with the exception of relationship quality with friends, which if pressed, I could probably argue is a bridging measure. And so now looking at sort of more complicated kinds of modeling. So this is using the latent bridging and bonding variables. I'm looking at the association with general cognition. This is cross-sectional. And so what we see is that for 5 of these 7 measures, We see significant associations between bridging and lots of different kinds of cognitive outcomes. And we don't see any significant effects of social bonding. And then we can look at change in bridging and bonding over time with some longitudinal modeling. And we do find that people have sort of these trajectories of bridging and bonding, that their networks change over time. And we can then model using longitudinal fixed effects, lab fixed effects models, which are a pretty conservative way to try to assess. I'm not going to say the word causation because there might be some economists in the room. But essentially, we still see these effects longitudinally or some associations between social bridging and 3 of these measures of cognitive function, which are sort of indicative of early stage Alzheimer's disease. And then we can also look at the association between latent bridging and bonding and social cognition. There's Anne, she's lovely. And so on the left, we have face memory, and then we have the rest of these are all measures of theory of mind. So can you tell if someone is lying to you? Can you infer someone else's emotion appropriately in an interaction? These are all measures essentially of social cognitive skills. And so we see, again, that if you have higher levels of social bridging in your social networks, those are associated with better social cognitive skills. We do see some effects of bonding here, but in the opposite direction you would expect, which is to say that if you have more bonding type networks, you have lower social cognition. So for those of you who study bonding networks and you love them, that's okay. I'm with you. I study them too. I study mental health. Don't be sad. There's something here for you too. And that is that we find that bridging is not predictive of sort of psychological well-being at all, whereas social bonding is. So we see significant associations here. For the left is geriatric depression scale, and then loneliness and self-reported happiness. So again, we're seeing that different types of networks confer different health effects potentially. Okay, so turning to the biological mechanisms, now I hope I've sort of convinced you that bridging is associated with cognition in some way. Otherwise, I really suck at this job. So this here is using some of our social network data and our brain imaging data. And so we simply look at associations between social bridging and gray matter density in different areas of the brain. The cool thing about this is that if you see associations in particular brain regions, you can infer some things about the neurological mechanisms there because we know what different areas of the brain do. And so what we're seeing here is significant associations really in 2 areas of the brain. One is the amygdala, which is sort of the social center of the brain. So this is where we process social emotional information. This is where we process fear. We do a lot of social learning in the amygdala. And it's also really important for social learning. Did I say that already? Social memory also. And then we also see associations with the thalamus, which is the information processing part of the brain. So that's where we take in sensory information from our environments, and then we sort of relay that information to different parts of the brain to do things. So people that have more of these social bridging type networks have larger networks, or sorry, they have more volume in those 2 areas of the brain, in the amygdala and the thalamus. And then sort of more pointedly examining the cognitive reserve hypothesis, we can look at whether neurodegeneration, the effect of neurodegeneration on cognitive outcomes, are moderated by social bridging measures. And we find that they are. So on the x-axis here is amygdala atrophy. So the amygdala I just talked about is the social center of the brain. So as you move to the right here on the graph, that means that your amygdala is getting smaller, right? So there's atrophy or neuropathology in the amygdala. And so on the y-axis is the Montreal Cognitive Assessment, which is general cognition. So what we would expect is that as your brain atrophies, as there's more neuropathology, that your cognition would go down, right? Your cognitive function would be worse. And that's exactly what we see in people with low levels of bridging. So the sort of darker confidence intervals here are people with low levels of bridging, so -1 standard deviation. We see the anticipated outcome here, but for those that have high levels of social bridging, we see what essentially is consistent with a cognitive reserve explanation, which is that there's no association between underlying neurodegeneration and cognitive outcomes, which was a pretty remarkable finding, we thought. And then we also, because we want to try to study things in a million different ways and ideally find the same thing, we're measuring cognitive reserve differently using kind of all the measures, all the the structural MRI measures that we have. So what we do here is we have, I think we've got something like 40 different measures of brain health, including like amyloid and tau burden. And we use that to predict cognitive function. And then we look at the residual. And so the residual becomes the dependent variable. So if your residual is higher than we would expect on average, then you have high reserve. If your residual is lower than we would expect on average, then you have low reserve. Does that make sense? Okay, great. And so what we find when we use this residual or this measure of sort of reserve as a dependent variable, that it's strongly associated with social bridging, but not with social bond measures. So it's just sort of confirming what we saw before with individual measures of like amygdala atrophy or atrophy in different areas of the brain. So what we think is happening is essentially this. So there are probably these baseline differences that are built up from having like these expansive complex networks over the life course. There are probably these sort of baseline differences in cognitive function where people that have more complex networks have sort of higher cognitive function to start with. But then they also maintain that higher level of cognitive function. And so the sort of gray area here is sort of analogous to our period of observation during the life course. So we see that their cognitive function doesn't actually change much over the course of the study. Whereas those with lower reserve, we see sort of the expected and earlier decline. And so because these are all people who are at higher risk for dementia, what we would expect is that eventually those in the higher reserve or the strong bridging group will develop Alzheimer's disease and dementia, but they'll kind of fall off a cliff and die really fast, which sounds bad, but that's exactly what you want if you're going to get Alzheimer's disease anyway. You want to get it later in life and you want to decline really fast and then die shortly thereafter, later, right? Rather than having sort of a protracted period of decline in function and quality of life. Okay, so I've laid out my argument. You guys have probably thought of like 18 alternative explanations, and that's your job. Good on you. So I'm going to talk about sort of our attempts to knock down some of those alternative explanations. So one is sort of methodological. And so this would be the idea that people who have some level of cognitive decline, even if it's mild, might forget their more peripheral alters, right? So in other words, they're not reporting on weaker ties, even though they might have them because they don't see them consistently or whatever. And so they forget about them. And so we can test this because we have both focal person reports and informant reports. So I mentioned that everyone has a study partner. So we get the perception of the focal person's network, both from their own point of view and from the point of view of their study partner. And so we can look to see is there corroboration there. And so what we find is there's much higher levels of corroboration among people with cognitive impairment. And we think that that happens because when someone starts to decline, their study partner, who's typically the caregiver, is sort of intimately related in who that person is seeing and what they're doing. So uncorroborated alters are actually much more likely to occur in those people that are cognitively normal because they have larger, less densely connected networks with fewer kin. And so they're doing social things and seeing people that their study partner doesn't necessarily know about. And then another possibility is that people, when they perceive that they're starting to experience cognitive decline, they might socially withdraw. And this has been pretty established in the literature, right? It's stigmatizing to have cognitive decline. Older adults are embarrassed about it. It's associated with depression, which is also associated with social withdrawal. So one possibility is that when someone perceives that they're starting to decline cognitively, they might socially withdraw. So it's not, this sort of mechanism that I proposed of bridging is associated with the resilience, but just it's this kind of reverse causation. And so what we find actually, because we have measures of what's called subjective cognitive decline, is that social bridging is associated with clinical cognitive decline, so like real objective decline, but it's not at all associated with subjective cognitive decline. So there's no relationship between having a bridging network and feeling like you're declining cognitively. And weirdly, there are these people who think that they're declining, but they're actually not. And then there are also people who are declining a lot but don't know it. So there's like, a decent number of people in these off diagonals. So that doesn't seem to be driving things. And then I also like just bringing up this study because I think it's really important in terms of potentially speaking a little bit more to causal ordering. And this is one of my former graduate students who's now at the University of Utah and was first author on this study. And he looked at cognitive complexity occupational complexity. And the interesting thing about this measure is that you can break it down into occupational complexity and working with things, working with data, and working with people. So someone who has a complex occupation and working with things might be like a watchmaker or something. Data would be like, somebody that sits on a computer and like works at Google. And then people are like us, right? Us, people in HR, people that regularly in their job interact with a lot of different kinds of people. And so what he found, looking across a whole range of outcomes, is that having an occupation that's more complex with regard to working with people is associated with better cognitive outcomes. And of course, occupation is chosen early in the life course typically, and it's long before we would expect any neurodegeneration or any kinds of cognitive decline. And then there also have recently, this is not my work and it doesn't occur in my lab, but I'm a huge fan of this person, Hiroko Dodge, who does these randomized controlled trials of bridging interventions. And she has 2 interventions now. And the one that these data are based on is essentially a video chat. They put up a photograph, and then the person on the other end, the older adult who has MCI, mild cognitive impairment, is having this 1-hour-long chat once a week with a random person. They're actually graduate students, but they don't get the same person every time. So it's not like they're developing bonding relationships. They're just having a conversation based on a photograph. And she finds with this randomized controlled trial that that's associated with essentially improvements in cognitive function. So there may actually be something happening with bridging, that it's either building new functional connections in the brain that like works around the neuropathology, which is consistent with cognitive reserve, or something else, we're not really sure. But these are actually associated with meaningful improvements in cognitive function relative to a control group. Okay, so maybe I've convinced you a little bit. If you do believe it, I think that there are some really important implications for the social mechanisms. So what is social bridging doing? We're trying to think about some new studies which would get at, like, is there something actually happening in that interaction that's more cognitively enriching? But what we hypothesize is that it's associated with access to sort of novel, diverse, and complex social stimuli. You have to remember more people, the connections between them are complex, and the sort of interactions with them on a day-to-day basis are more cognitively enriching. They're more difficult. They produce sort of eustress or good stress, which is healthy for the brain. And if you think about interacting with sort of acquaintances, they have different ideas, attitudes, and values than you, which is sort of consistent with basic network theory, but they also expose you to new activities. There are different visual stimuli. You're looking at different faces. There's different auditory and verbal stimuli because they might have accents or talk differently than you, and you have to just work harder to understand their point of view, to understand what their intentions are, to understand their emotions, et cetera. And so it just takes more cognitive processing to interpret the social cues that they're giving. And so sometimes I'll talk about, like, when I'm sitting on the couch with my partner, like watching TV, like we're just grunting at each other. Like, we're not actually having a real conversation. But if I'm interacting with someone, like in the meetings that I've been having today, I am like on. And that's why at the end of the day, I'm going to be exhausted from talking to all of you, right? But in a good way. And hopefully it's done something positive for my brain in a way that it doesn't when you're interacting with these sort of repeated interaction partners that you like almost know intuitively what they're thinking, what they're going to say, et cetera. And this research has potentially some really interesting implications for health disparities, right? So one of those that we've thought about is the neurological benefits of being in diverse and enriching environments. So we see a lot of disparities in ADRD, for example, that would be consistent with social bridging as a mechanism. So we know, for example, that people living in rural areas are more susceptible to Alzheimer's disease and dementia than those living in urban communities. It also suggests that there may be something positive in terms of brain health for those who live in racially or socioeconomically integrated environments versus those who live in segregated environments. And then also we can look at things like group differences in social bridging potential that we know exist. So people with lower levels of education tend to have lower levels of bridging. And so we started to do like kind of some of these analyses to understand are health disparities in part driven by these differences in social bridging. And so this was something I published in kind of a theoretical argument or article and focus on the top line here. But it's this idea that stratification by all these categories that we care about is associated with access to social bridging, which might then be associated with these downstream, like biological cascading consequences that have implications for the onset and course of cognitive aging. And so my lab has been doing a little bit of work along these lines. So for example, social bridging may be a mechanism of educational disparities in ADRD. So we find that network bridging explains almost a third of the educational disparity in cognitive function, and about 24% of the educational disparity in cognitive change index. And then we've also been looking at rural-urban disparities. This is my former postdoc, Adam Roth. He has an R01 looking at rural-urban differences in social networks. And he uses ecological momentary assessments, and we're looking at how those are associated with changes in cognitive function over time. And in some of the data that we have right now, we do in fact find that urban residents have more bridging potential in their networks, and that that's associated or mediates some of the relationship with differences in cognitive outcomes. And that's all I have. I'm happy to take questions. These are my collaborators. They're all amazing, and I could not do this work without them. This is my lab, and funded mostly by the National Institute on Aging. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take questions. Oh, that's nice. Thank you, Zoom. Yeah.
Great talk. I have a lot of questions, but I'll start with, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on political science, if that's what I do.
Yeah.
But, I think something counterintuitive for me is thinking about our meritocracy and how many of these people are, interacting with people and most of their jobs, and yet we also see a lot of cognitive decline. I'm curious to see your thoughts on like how this sort of conversation might explain some of the things that you see.
Can you say more about?
Yeah, so like.
Yeah, the last part, the things that we see.
Like, I guess these are people who are very connected with various people. They're, if you go back to that slide where you had like the people work, data work.
Oh, yeah, by occupation.
Right,
Yeah.
by occupation. This is like people work.
Mm-hmm.
But then also they're also very like important nodes in their networks in many ways, right? They're powerful influence people. And so to me, these both sort of point towards the direction of like, these are good for cognitive health. And yet we see a lot of cognitive decline. And maybe this is just people are continuing working a lot longer than the average person that maybe you're talking about in this population. But I was just curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I think like, if I'm understanding what you're asking, there's a couple of threads there that I want to pull on. One is sort of the relationship between work and cognitive outcomes, because work is, I think, one of the primary sources of cognitive reserve across the life course. And I think the study that I put up bears that out. But people stop working at a certain point, and then older adults' trajectories of sort of social connectedness following retirement, there's like wide variability in what that looks like. So some of you may know older adults who retire and then kind of watch TV all the time, right? And their networks really shrink. They don't maintain contact with their coworkers. And they sort of have, this like shrinkage in their networks. But then there are other older adults that you may know, examples of this, where they're volunteering, they're hanging out with their grandkids and their grandkids' friends and their parents, right? So they're in these sort of multi-generational situations, or they have a very active social life with friends. And so I think that what happens is that because retirement, especially for like this older generation that I'm looking at, a lot of them have stopped working kind of around the normal retirement age. I think if we look at younger generations where people are working longer, we might find something different. But I think, you tend to see this sort of divergence in the extent to which people's social lives sort of atrophy after retirement or not. And then the other thing that I wanted to pull at is this idea that cognitive reserve is actually built over the life course. So I think, part of the reason why we see these effects of people work, as you said, is that the functional connectivity in the brain and the level of sort of structural integrity in the brain is built over the life course. And in fact, we see some of this. I work with Coulter Mitchell, and he works with the future family studies. And so they can see really interesting cognitive differences, even in like young kids. And so you build it up over the life course. And then like at some point, you can't really tell whether it's like cognitive development versus cognitive decline, right? And so I think, and I tried to show that in that graph, some people just start higher, right? And the higher you start, then like you can fall a little more and still remain like really have high cognitive function. I don't know if I answered your question at all.
That's a very well phrased question. That was great.
Okay, sorry. Sorry, that was my.
Interesting. I'm curious about a few things that are maybe not concretely formed in my mind, so I'm just going to throw them out there.
Yeah.
I was wondering about what the inverse of connection is in terms of how it feels. So are people who have, so it's the opposite of having bridging and bonding loneliness. Is loneliness a feeling, or is that measured by the number of connections that someone has? And then I was thinking also about the relationship between like loneliness and grief. And the reason why that might be interesting is, for example, imagining people who have, let's say, bridging networks, but they come together over a traumatic event or a difficult goal that they might have. So thinking about social movements, for example. So how does that fit within our understanding of, because in some ways those are opposite things, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Difficult conversations, maybe it goes into the, those two markers that you had on the graph in terms of obligations, social obligations, and how they might connection or just sadness when people come together.
Yeah. So I think that's a really interesting line of thought. So no. Oh, shoot. That's right after. Okay. So basically she asked about kind of like the duality of like difficult conversations, and if people are coming together around shared grief or trauma, that they're interacting with lots of weak ties, and that might confer like bridging benefits, but then also they're talking about something negative. And then the first thing you asked was about sort of the relationship between loneliness and bridging and bonding and social isolation and how it's measured. Did I get it?
It's felt, because I can imagine, like, I like humans, so I want to be around a lot of humans.
Yes.
I've heard that some people can not,
I know. Yeah.
and they're fine.
Yes.
Is it a feeling, or is it actually measured? Like, how does feeling intervene in the measurement of number of connections within a network?
Yes. Okay. So then you asked, how does feeling intervene with the sort of experience of being in these bridging networks, right? Okay. Did I get it all? Okay.
Like,
Yeah.
loneliness as a feeling.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. So I was gonna start with the second question. Now I'm gonna start there, but then tag me on the second one, but you might have to remind me what you asked me. Okay. So the weird thing about loneliness, and I have came into you starting to look at this, is it's actually not that closely related to it's definitely not that closely related to bridging, and it's not that related to social bonding even. So like these kind of objective measures of networks are not that associated with feelings of loneliness. And that is in part like due to what your kind of intuition on this, which is that, some people don't actually want to be around a lot of people, right? Or they have like lower social needs. And so one of the things and so that's different from social isolation. So loneliness is the feeling of not having enough connectedness. Social isolation is the objective state of not having a lot of connections, and it's measured in a lot of different ways. I would say that bridging and bonding are both related to social isolation and may or may not be related to loneliness depending on the individual. And so what I would really like to do, but we haven't done so far because collecting these network data is just super intensive. It takes a really long time. I would love to look at like personality differences, would be like one way to look at this. So something like trait extroversion, and do people who are introverted, just sort of a lower level of social bridging, get them the benefits that it takes someone who's extroverted, like they have to have more bridging to get sort of those same cognitive benefits. Or maybe it's the opposite. I don't really know, but I would have to think that something like extroversion would matter. Another way that I thought about this is I like really briefly mentioned the association between racial homophily and lower cognitive function. But I have to think that there's some countervailing mechanism with stress. And so I really want to look at that by racial group, right? And so it's kind of similar, right? So I want to know, maybe it has a lot of cognitive benefits to be in a diverse network if you're white. But if you're a member of a minoritized group, it doesn't, because there's this counterbalance of like stress, right, and tokenism. And so I think we always have to keep in mind that like these are sort of aggregate relationships, and there's always going to be individual variation that's going to moderate this relationship potentially. And in some cases, I just haven't looked at it because I haven't had time. And in some cases, we don't have the data to look at it. But I am super, super interested in that like idea. So, you know, if you want to come work with my lab, if you want to write some papers together, I'd be super into that. But I think it's really interesting and absolutely likely to be true. We just don't have any evidence of it. And then you asked something else, which I've totally forgotten.
Essentially about when people come together, but when they come together, what they're talking about is that.
Oh, so that's kind of the same idea of this duality, right? Like, yeah, so having a shared trauma can be, you know, like, so we know this about like racial identity, for example, right? Like that having like shared experiences of discrimination is like builds like stronger racial identity, which has all these benefits, blah, blah, blah. But then also you have to counterbalance that with like the stress that you experience being in these interactions. And I think that's just another kind of a way of thinking about what I was saying, which is that there's always going to be individual variation. And some of that may be related to the stress that's associated with those interactions. Because some interactions are inherently stressful and they can be distressing rather than eustress, right? So bad stress rather than good stress. And we know that stress negatively affects the brain. So I have to think that there are these countervailing sort of forces that I'm just not measuring. I'm measuring the aggregate, essentially. That's a great set of ideas. Yeah.
Very interesting. I was going to ask somewhat relatedly, and I originally started thinking about this because I just read that book about trauma and the brain, the body keeps score is what it's called. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's basically the concept that, as you were mentioning, you undergo traumatic experiences, it changes your brain chemistry in the short term and potentially in the long term as well. So I was wondering whether you have any plans or if you know of any research that focuses on similar topics in like a lower income population. Because like I, for example, am a PhD student here and I study like, you know, the decision-making process around accessing government services. And a lot of people who, you know, in the context I'm studying are trying to do that in a very stressful situation. And so decision-making is altered during that time. So I was just wondering if you have any thoughts on that or like what governments could be doing about that, you know, more intentionally to create processes that are more accessible.
Yeah. So I have very little thoughts about what governments can be doing right now. I'm trying to avoid any thought about governments and what they're doing right now. But I have thought a lot about what you were saying in terms of low income populations or people with low levels of education. So you might have noticed from the descriptive statistics that this is like a relatively highly educated sample. And so we just got renewed for another 5 years. And one of our major goals for the renewal is to have a subsample of people who have less than a high school education and also a subsample of Black respondents, which we have a decent number, but not enough to really do what I want to do. And I think that's exactly right. Like I want to understand these processes in lower income groups because they could be totally different. We may not see the same relationship. What's interesting is we have this other study that I didn't talk about at all called the person-to-person health interview study, which is larger and it's state representative. And the network data are not as good and we don't have neuroimaging data, so I didn't talk about it. But what we actually find is that social bridging in that sample, where we have a lot of lower SES people, like a good subsample there, that the effects of social bridging are actually on their cognitive outcomes are stronger than those for people who have higher SES. And the same is also true for racial differences. So they matter more. So I'm not exactly sure, right, without having like neuroimaging data or other things. But yes, I think what might be happening is that these lower SES groups don't have as much access to things that might confer cognitive reserve through occupation. We know that people with more education, have like sort of more complex experiences. They have access to, going to museums and whatever, traveling and things. They're more mobile. And so I think that in those cases, lower SES folks who do have more bridging networks, that can serve as an especially powerful sort of driver of cognitive resilience in that group, because they don't already have access to other structural advantages that would build reserve. But I'm not sure, because it's kind of preliminary, it's cross-sectional, so that's why we're trying to develop this subsample in our cohort where we could actually look at these things longitudinally.
We have one person online.
Okay.
Who wants to ask a question, so Oliver, you can put yourself unmuted, and then Peter Vitaliano.
I met with him earlier.
Okay.
Yeah.
Peter says you need to study hostility. I'm sure it is associated with bridging, and we know it is associated with insulin. Insulin crosses the blood-brain barrier and is associated with plaques in the brain.
Okay. So is the I don't know if I can have a conversation with him through Zoom.
I think he might be on the phone.
Okay.
Peter,
can you hear me?
Hey, so would you expect hostility to be negatively related to bridging?
No. Yes. Negatively related. Yes, absolutely. I would expect. Go ahead.
So this could be like a confounding, or an alternative biological mechanism, essentially.
Yeah, because hostility, I mean, we've done lots of work on this, is definitely associated with insulin resistance. And insulin crosses the blood-brain barrier. And we know that now a lot of people are studying, Alzheimer's has been called the disease of the 21st century, but so has diabetes. So now a lot of people think that Alzheimer's is just diabetes in the brain.
Yeah, I've heard that. Yeah. That's super interesting. So I will put that in the category of like psychological variables that I should have in my study, but don't.
Yeah.
I get a lot of flack from my psychologist collaborators.
Yeah. I could send you a good hostility measure that's really short.
All right. Yeah, send it. Because we're actually revamping the instrument right now. So that'd be great.
Okay, you're gonna ask Oliver. Oliver, can you unmute yourself?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Professor Perry. I have kind of two questions. One is, I'm interested in whether and how the measurements or values of social bonds or interactions are impacted by technology, specifically like social media. So that is, does technology play a role in our understanding and measurement of the value of social interaction or bonds? And the second question is, what do you expect to find or change in the research by adding functional MRI? I guess my question is, how should we bridge sociological data with functional fMRI? And just a little bit of my background, I studied neuroscience, kind of the sociology of neuroscience. So I think about fMRI data as being a lot more precarious and a lot more problematic to interpret. And so I'm wondering how do you see that playing a role in the research that you have?
Yeah, those are two great questions. Do you need a postdoc? Because I'm hiring one and I would love a social neuroscientist. If so, hit me up over email. Oh, he's a professor. Well, shit. Do you want to come to IU? We have an aging cluster hire right now. Okay, that's the connection. Got it. Oh, all right. Okay. Well, thank you for your questions. So the second question about fMRI. So I think what we'll be able to look at with fMRI is to dig into some of the hypotheses around functional connectivity. So, right now we're showing that the structural integrity of the brain is associated with social bridging, but what we expect and what we've actually has already been shown in some studies, like Matt Brashears does this kind of research, is that brains are more functionally connected if you have larger and more complex social networks. And so I expect to see more functional connectivity in the brain with fMRI if you have higher levels of bridging. And so Anne Crindle is my collaborator who does the fMRI work. And so I'm going to rely heavily on her in terms of the methodology, and hopefully, I mean, she's amazing. So she'll be great. But that's kind of the idea there. And I have like a dream paper that I want to write that I hope would be like maybe a science or a nature paper, because we can all dream, that would be associating brain networks with social networks. And so if you want to get in on that publication, hit me up, because we're just sort of starting down this area with the functional data. And then your first question, social media. Oh my goodness. Okay. So the caveat to this is that, of course, I've been looking in this sample of older adults whose brain did not develop in the time of social media. And they are actually, a lot of them, on social media, largely on Facebook. And so they're using it as a tool to connect with people in their lives. They're using it to connect with their family members, et cetera. So in this cohort of older adults, I would expect it to be potentially associated with maintenance of social bonding ties, but also potentially ability to maintain weaker ties with people that have moved away. And so I've not actually looked at it in terms of its association with bridging and bonding, but that would be my expectation. We have looked at the association between social media use in these older adults and cognitive outcomes, and we have not found anything. I think that would be completely different if we're looking at younger generations now, decades from now. Having grown up in sort of the area of, or the era of social media. And we know that social media use is associated with more sort of bridging type networks. So kind of like weaker, a lack of like strong ties, knowing a lot of people, but not knowing them well. But I actually don't think that social media interactions are going to be very strongly related to cognitive outcomes. And that's because the kind of interactions that you're having online are very shallow. So when I'm interacting with someone in person or even over Zoom, I have to interpret their facial cues. I have to try to understand their tone of voice, their emotions. It's just a lot more cognitively taxing to interact with someone face-to-face than it is to interact with someone online. So I would guess that having these kind of weak, intermittent interactions with people over social media are not going to confer the same cognitive benefits as interacting with an acquaintance in person. That's totally a guess.
Thank you.
Quick last question from.
Hi.
Thanks for this great talk. I actually have a couple questions, but I think I'm unfortunately not going to. I'll just throw one in. And as you were talking, I was thinking a lot about especially stress as a result of being racially isolated in sexual circumstances. So especially with respect to what we've been about hostility, I was just curious if you had already made such a research, but that how, say, like racial isolation acts as a moderator.
I have not looked at that because our sample of minoritized respondents is small. It's really hard, at least in this study, to do those kinds of analyses. But I think you're probably right. And again, like that experience of like tokenism or whatever is probably counterbalances the benefits to those individuals in terms of the bridging that they would accrue from being in these occupations. I think it's probably highly stressful and probably negative both for mental health and for cognitive health for that reason. But I don't know for sure. That's something we might actually be able to, not with regard to occupation, but with regard to sort of racial homophily in the network more generally, that we might be able to test with our other data set where we have a larger sample. So if it's something you're interested in, I mean, you'd be welcome to use those data. Those are the P2P data. I'm not sure we would have all the measures you need, but it would be super interesting. And I think you're probably right.
If I could, I have one more quick one, which was, like I said, I really appreciate your work. I've been to a talk of yours before. As I recall at that talk, you said that much of this gets locked in that physiological dynamics of Alzheimer's and the about 40 years later. But then the Doge laboratory sort of suggests that there's space for later in life. So I just wanted to hear some.
Yeah, so yes, so probably what I said is that you can see some of these underlying neurological differences in the 40s, in your 40s. That's when you sort of start to see like neuropathology, underlying neuropathology set in. And so I think when I said that, I don't know that I meant that it was unchangeable, but just that it would be like experiences that have, happened over the life course could be contributing to cognitive reserve in older ages. But I will say, I actually talked to Hiroko before her results came out. And I thought that there's no way that this would work. I was like, there's absolutely no way this is going to work. It's like too brief an intervention. It's like not, like whatever. But it worked beautifully and I was wrong. And so it's actually consistent with theories of cognitive reserve because they don't know whether you just have a more like sort of like functionally connected and larger network to start with. And then it can just sort of accept more neuropathology before you start to see cognitive function, or whether there's actually neurogenesis. The brain actually responds sort of in vivo to pathology when you apply like cognitively enriching or stimulating environments. And so I think Hiroko's research would suggest that the latter is at play. I think the former is probably also at play, but that there might be sort of both mechanisms happening simultaneously, which is amazing for interventions, right? And the idea that like maybe it's not too late, even if you've started to have an onset of impairment, that you could actually preserve or even improve your cognition with the right kinds of interventions.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks.
We're a little over time, but totally worth
Sorry.
it.
Thanks, everybody.